mouth disease. Mr. Jacobs, what typically happens to animals that have come into contact with foot and mouth disease?
Thanks for having me today. I appreciate it. Typically, it's not fatal in animals. It typically only affects the younger aged animals of the infected population. Typically, the animals will recover from the disease in 2 to 3 weeks, although it has been known to take up to about 6 months for some of the animals to get over it. The problem with the virus, though, is that it is highly contagious. Nearly 100% of the animals exposed to the virus do become infected. Right now, the Plant and Animal Health Inspection Service's long-standing response to an outbreak of the virus is to quarantine the infected population and then to destroy the animals that are infected or that were exposed to the disease.
The strain found in Ohio is rumored to be one which is contagious to humans. What does this mean for the public? Are we all in danger?
The disease does not have an effect on humans. The problem when humans do come in contact with the virus, though, is that humans are a source for spreading the virus. The virus has been known to live inside the nasal passages of humans for up to 28 hours.
But what you're talking about is the usual strain of foot and mouth disease. What if this is a new strain that actually affects people?
I'm Erin Zahn for ZNN News. Today's Secretary of Agriculture, Mike Johans, announced that foot and mouth disease has been diagnosed in Ohio. This is the first instance of FMD in the United States since 1929. Further testing is currently underway at the Foreign Animal Disease Diagnostic Center at Plum Island, New York. Efforts are currently underway to eradicate this disease by both state and federal officials. Further information will be forthcoming. This has been a special report from ZNN News.
This is Action 10 News.
This is Wharf Blitzer, Action 10 News. According to our sources, a member of the local community, the community that has been infected with a agricultural disease, has now traveled up to Canada. For more on this story and the unfolding risks, we've invited to our remote location the Deputy Minister of Agriculture of Canada, Mr. Terry Miller. Mr. Miller, is there any truth to the story that a member of our farming community whose farm has been infected, a man by the name of Mr. Yarish, has traveled to Toronto with his family?
Oh, our office certainly does not keep track of where someone may or may not vacation.
Fair enough. But if this is the case, doesn't this mean that there is a great likelihood that this disease will now spread through Canada?
Well, that would depend on a variety of circumstances.
Such as? I mean, there must be some criteria for these kinds of events. And furthermore, why hasn't your office or anybody in Canada notified the people on this side of the border of the possible risks of traveling if they are in the contaminated area?
Well, what I can say, what I am prepared to say, is that foot and mouth disease is not contagious to humans, so we don't have to worry about things like that.
And danger to Canadian livestock?
That would depend, again, on a variety of circumstances.
We will continue to follow this story as it unfolds. Wharf Blitzer signing out.
Mr. Yarish's cousin owns a dairy farm in southern Ontario. The same day that Mr. Yarish's cows started to get sick, bless you, that's unrelated to FMD, Mr. Yarish's wife and children left to visit the cousin's farm. We've just learned that Mr. Yarish's family had gone to check on the sick calves right before getting in the car in order to go to Ontario. One of the first things that the Yarish family did when they got to the cousin's farm was walk around the barns to see the animals. It was not until a few days after their arrival in Ontario that Mr. Yarish calls to tell them of the possible FMD. We begin with our Canadian friends. What actions would Canada take to prevent the spread of FMD into Canada?
Okay. Representing the a large group who would be convened at this point in time on our side of the border, the reality that there was an announcement from the Secretary that you have FMD means that the border would be closed to other passengers moving through. But I guess our scenario is that this family has moved across in advance, because once it's closed, it doesn't mean people can't go, but we would be very scrupulous in looking at farm. You know, if you answered you were going to a farm, coming from a farm, you'd be pulled aside, you'd be looked at, your boots, your luggage, and everything else would be looked at. So it would be unlikely, once that announcement's taken place, that we would be allowing this farm family in. But even in advance of that, it's interesting, we have a treaty, it's the North American Animal Health Committee, Mexico, the U.S., and Canada have looked at the scenarios of what would happen in the event of an outbreak on one side of the border. And we've agreed that we would notify each other before we had a confirmed diagnosis. In other words, in the event of what's called a presumptive diagnosis, which is strong suspicions on a premises, clinical signs, that the sample's been sent off to Plum Island, and there's a high level of alert, which I think by now, it's hard to know exactly how many days we are here, but the chief veterinary officer in Canada would have been informed by the chief veterinary officer in the U.S. that something was happening. We wouldn't be closing the border, but we would be under this agreement allowed to start raising the alarm bells at the border about farm families moving and so on.
But how would you know that Mr. Yarsh's wife came from a farm?
That would be, right now there's a fairly open border, and I think that there has to be for commerce purposes. There is a, we can in fact pull over people and you know, ask questions, and there are, I haven't driven across lately, but of course there's that declaration, were you on a farm, are you coming to a farm? I mean, did they do that when they're driving? I'm always flying and filling that thing in, okay? And so that, of course, would alert people, and that's a legitimate piece that we have, of paper we have between the two countries.
They don't do that for driving purposes, only when you're flying that you're asked if you've been visiting a farm in the past 14 days. So, possibly there could be an information sharing piece between Canada and the U.S. that would require U.S. to inform us of this outbreak here, and if you know that people have traveled, to advise Canada.
Who would you be information sharing with in the U.S.? Who would be your point of contact? How would this work?
Well, right now, of course, it's Chief Veterinary Officer, CVO to CVO, that we get notified. And my concept of how this would work, and the reason we're doing this, is not to shut the border to trade in advance of a confirmed diagnosis, but so that the countries can get ready. And I would suggest that one of the ways that the countries would get ready is probably, I mean, every time you go across the border, you are stopped and you're asked questions. And we have the Canadian Border Services Agency would probably be given an alert to ask every American traveling into Canada whether or not they'd been on a farm recently, if they were coming from the area that the CVO had indicated wasn't a potentially infected zone. So I think something like that could happen. The point, too, is that when we were first looking at the investigation, and Dr. Dorman was talking to the farmer about trace-outs, trace-ins, and all these investigative pieces, that knowledge of that farm family would have been picked up at that point in time. Now, the question that I have, and we've been brainstorming about what we would do, and the question is whether or not the U.S. government could, in fact, release the name of, because that's very specific information that will be garnered right at the beginning. The family has traveled to Canada. And whether there's a privacy issue with, in fact, divulging that to Canada, you know, and with the presumptive diagnosis, and then certainly with the confirmed diagnosis, whether they could, in fact, say that, because they clearly would present a tremendous risk given the nature of this virus. And maybe a lawyer here could answer that in terms of the American side being able to divulge that information.
Judge Polster, you want to comment on that?
I'm not aware of any privacy issues. This isn't personal medical or health information on an individual. This is that their livestock has been infected with a communicable disease. So it's a fact, and it should be. I can't see any impediment to disclosing that.
Professor Hoffman?
We don't have privacy, I think, about the fact that we travel because we have to show passports, and there's the record then that we travel, and they get the name and all sorts of information, so I don't see a problem with that.
And then from the perspective of the Canadian government, given what Professor Hoffman has said, what's the next steps then?
The problem we have right now is that we do not, the problem we have right now is that we do not know the farm to which this family traveled. Do we know? Are we aware whether, we know it's somewhere in southern Ontario, but we really don't know. Southern Ontario is a big, big place. What farm did they go to? Unless we send our inspectors to all the farms in southern Ontario, because there's certainly power for detection purposes to send our inspectors to farms, to areas to do their tests and to look at animals, conveyances and whatnot. But at this point, where did that family go? Where is that farm?
I think.
Go ahead.
I suspect Mr. Yarish will know where his wife went, and he'll tell us. And so that's the information we get. We hope.
Mr. Yarish is saying no.
He's not telling us.
But no, apparently they wouldn't feel any compunction in telling us where she was. That's what I just learned, is that they would say not only did she cross the border, but she went X, Y, or Z. So,
where is she?
Well, he would know where his wife went, and they would tell us, is my understanding.
He says he's not going to tell us.
Oh. The wild card. The wild card.
So, maybe we just have to start with the detection of disease, and do we have the manpower? We know they have come somewhere in southern Ontario, and start from there and, do our inspection and go in, test some animals, and, if really it's foot and mouth, hopefully it will not be long before we find it, given the signs that I have heard. And pardon me, I'm not a scientist, so I do not know, but all throughout the day we hear that it's it's fast moving, it can go very wide. So hopefully it will not take long before, through this inspection, to find where this disease is or where it may be, or find one farm and start from there. But at this point, it's a matter of the science. But the legal power is there to start detecting this disease.
Would there be, Mr. Angelopoulos, contact between FEMA here and the equivalent in Canada in order to try to begin not only finding where Mrs. Yarish is, but where is this farm and what has she been exposed to? And I guess the question is, sir, what's the level of cooperation? Mr. Watson, maybe you want to chime in here also.
I'll defer right now. I mean, that's more the medical side. I mean, from our perspective, we think that information would be very important because of the latest information we got of that they were going to plant that disease in other places. The knowledge of travel to Canada, if that happened, it's not another plant per se. We would evaluate that in a little different perspective than another attack somewhere, the virus being spread other places by the terrorists, not by just normal travel. So, the minute that we got this information, the Canadians are part of the intelligence community. They would have been informed of the potential of this type of attack, and it would have been going through all the government channels that information would be exchanged through the intelligence community as well as through the medical and the scientific community.
And in terms of the FEMA communities?
That's a good question. It's changing. In fact, I just found out that, is it a treaty or an agreement?
It's a committee that was formed under NAFTA to pursue harmonization of standards within animal health?
I think 5 years ago there was, unfortunately, very little communication. We did have some modest play and some exercises with Canada, Top Off 2 and Top Off 3. And that was to the good. 5 years ago, G8 was going back and forth between Windsor and Detroit, as I recall. And we weren't able to send teams up there or you down with us back and forth to make sure that we had medical backup should it be needed for the dignitaries that were there. And the reason at the time was that we didn't have a treaty, and the State Department felt it didn't have, I shouldn't be quoting them, it didn't have the legal authority, as I recall, to allow us to go back and forth from our site up to Windsor and back and forth. Since that time, and I was unaware of the progress, so it's good to know. I don't know if it's reached the level of a treaty yet. I don't think it has. I don't think it has, or has it?
For exchange of personnel in the event
Yes.
of a... no, we've got something called the International Animal Health Emergency Response Reserve that's been signed by the CVOs of Australia, New Zealand, U.S., Canada, Ireland, and the UK, and that forms a basis for the principles of an exchange. It's an MOU sort of draft. It doesn't, though, overcome some of the licensing restrictions that you would have with an exchange of professional personnel. That has to be done in bilats, so we're working on a Canada-US one. Australia and New Zealand are going to do templates as well. So we hope to be able to overcome those things very quickly, although we have the framework in place, and hopefully that would be helpful at least, but we've got more work to do there to be able to exchange personnel, veterinary medical personnel.
It seems that we're still at the mutual, what would you call it, exercise across the border. People are going across, but it's different than sending professionals to treat or work. It's bureaucrats like us going back and forth for exercises, and we can do that. But the other step is the one that will have to be shaken out. I would think that we're more close to being ready than we ever have been. 5 years ago, there was basically nothing. So now we're at the verge. But to answer your question, it'd be tough. We're probably not there at operational capacity right now. I don't think that we were there.
And Ms. Minta, what would be most helpful from your perspective in terms of trying to deal with the situation?
As I mentioned earlier on, the difficulty with advising the client is, just what I said, we don't know what it is, so we should try and find out where this disease is. And we can act on the basis of suspicion. So at the minimum, we know that these people came to Southern Ontario. We can put a control area declaration.
What does that mean?
The control area is just a written declaration prepared by an inspector. And normally it will be invoked if we know a farm. So, we go to one farm and it's on suspicion. We serve the farmer with a declaration, and what happens is that there is a movement restriction on that farm. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out, nothing.
It's similar to a quarantine.
That's right, but what that does is it also allows the inspector to declare another 5-kilometer zone around this infected place, also as an infected place. It's different. We can also do a quarantine. What is different from a quarantine is that it doesn't allow the extra 5 kilometers. The quarantine will be just the animal, if we know, or the clothing, if we know where they are. But we cannot do the further 5 kilometers. If we do the declaration of infected place, there is a discretion to do another 5 kilometers around that, and all that will be infected place.
And in the context of trying to understand who has come to the farm and where have they been, what they have been exposed to prior to that, what are you going to be looking for?
Once the inspector is on the farm, they can inspect and test the animals. They can take samples. They can inspect records. And records mean, records of animals that have moved in and out of the farm within that period can all be inspected. And that's conveyances going in and out of the farm.
And how would that in any way, would it at all restrict American travel into Canada or Canadian travel into America?
As far as movement of persons is concerned, it's a little bit difficult because our laws protect freedom of movement.
Into the U.S. or within Canada?
Within Canada, but I would imagine, I'm not sure what treaty there is between Canada and U.S. that would restrict movement of persons, but certainly for movement of products, we do have a power to impose, by regulation, impose restrictions on importation of animals and what they call things, which could include the feed as well coming into Canada. There is a legal authority to do that.
Mr. Waski, from your perspective, what would you then be looking for here? You are trying to find the terrorist who has introduced this agent into Mr. Yarish's farm. Mr. Yarish's wife is now, he won't tell us, or is she?
We would become very good friends with Mr. Yarish of basic, yeah, that's right, and we would live there until pretty much what has happened on his farm, who has come visited, any suspicious activity. We'd coordinate with the local sheriff or local police department, who's been stopped around. We do a offline National Center for Information out of West Virginia of all cars stopped by police and license plates run in a certain area around the farm of any suspicious, police officers. They know what's unusual in their communities.
All right, so let's say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And we'd find, okay, why did you stop that person? Where were they from? And who did he find out on his farm? Who delivered the feed? All the delivery people. We'd start backtracking all the interviews on all those people to find out what happened.
And is it reasonable to assume that the Canadian authorities would have asked you to ask Mr. Yarish, where is Mrs. Yarish?
Absolutely.
And knowing you, Mr. Waski, you would get that information from Mr. Yarish.
We would cajole in the best way we could.
Exactly where he said, just as long as you keep her.
Thank you. You and I have to have a beer later, I think.
All right. Ms. Mehta?
For a moment, I was going to say that we could call in the police or RCMP, but obviously these people have not committed any crime or any offense. So we can't even do that.
Dr. Inch, let's say now Waski here has helped you. Mr. Yarish has told you where Mrs. Yarish is, one way or the other. You now know on what farm. What do you do?
Well, we certainly, similar to what happens here, we have trained foreign animal disease diagnosticians, and we would call upon them. That the federal government, in Canada, it's quite different than the U.S., and it's the federal government that has primacy over all the activities, regardless of province, because it's a reportable disease under the Health of Animals Act. So we would end up sending in our foreign animal disease diagnosticians who are federal veterinarians, and there's not a huge veterinary contingent at the provincial level. It's just the way it works. And we have the primacy. So we'd certainly, again, given the knowledge we have that it's that they came across with these clothes on, we would declare an infected place, like Mrs. Minta just said, and we'd probably at the same time be having our staff going to the other, what we'd call high-risk trace-outs. By talking with the farmer, we'd find out who's been on the premises since the visitors arrived, where they've gone, because it's a disease that does get transmitted very easily. Depending on the course of the disease, if it was like 2 or 3 days later, we could even be taking samples from animals and perhaps starting to detect the virus. Otherwise, they'd just be quarantined under our observation, and we'd start collecting samples when we thought that there was a potential to actually detect the disease. In fact, though, I doubt we'd even, given this, we might be very lucky. We might decide just to destroy. We would certainly consider just destroying the herd or depopulating, yeah. So given the lucky break we have, and that it's the index case, as we say, potentially, we may nip it in the bud by depopulating at that point. And there's certainly all the powers to do that based on suspicion. So we depopulate, and our premise would be that we should bury it on the farm in the event that there were virus. We try and get whatever the disposal method the preferred is, on-farm disposal, always in principle, and then because of course leaving the farm with infected carcasses is not a great idea, carrying them down the road. And as I say, we'd be doing the tracings.
And we learned earlier that Mr. Yarish has had visitors, and how are you going to check whether those who had been visiting his farm may also conceivably be trying to come into Canada, and how then would you restrict travel or movement of Americans into Canada?
I'm not sure if we can do border alerts on people or not.
I think what we could do is, we could certainly, knowing where the outbreak is in the U.S., anyone traveling would be stopped and investigated. Just, ask the question, are you from a farm? Have you been on a farm? Are you going to a farm? Those usual questions.
From a law enforcement perspective, and quite frankly, a political perspective, until someone or a human gets sick from hoof and mouth disease, you are not going to get the political and or law enforcement will to restrain movements of humans. I don't see it as a reasonable response if it may be transmitted without anybody getting sick. Of the freedom of movement and restricting mass people from moving based on pure suspicion, I don't see that happening.
And movement of livestock?
Livestock's entirely different.
Okay.
You have a proven record of transmission of a very serious disease, highly contagious. The movement of livestock would be no problem at all because of that danger to the economic well-being of the country.
Ms. Menta, do you want to address that?
Yes. Apart from putting regulations in place to stop importation, the inspector has got administrative powers at the border if any animal is imported in, to stop it, detain it, test it, order it removed out of Canada, or it's forfeited to the Crown. And once it's forfeited, it can be disposed of, it can be destroyed. So movement of animals and the feed and clothing and whatnot, we can control fairly easily, even without regulations. The inspector at the border can do that.
Meaning that you, in essence, can restrict, severely curtail, the movement of American livestock into Canada.
Oh,
yeah. Imagine so, yeah.
We, as they say, we'd close the border. and you would too if Canada had foot and mouth disease. And that's why we're so careful in this protocol we've drawn up about what point in time that border closes. A presumptive, you get ready. So we would have heard about the presumptive before, as Leo was taking the samples and sending them off to Plum, we would know. And then the confirmed diagnosis point is when the border closes. And that means, of course, not that people stop moving across, but that products and things that are, and animals that are susceptible are no longer allowed. So that would be meat, and a lot of, there'd be a huge backlog at that border.
And actually, the threshold for the regulations is very, very low. All the minister needs to do is whatever measure is necessary for the purpose of preventing the disease from entering Canada.
For how long?
I guess for as long as the disease is present.
And in fact, we'd probably follow the guidelines that have been developed for international trade under the International Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE. And they recommend that if Canada were fortunate enough not to be infected, we wouldn't be, if we were, we'd just become a rather homogeneous group, and we'd all be dealing with the disease, and trade would be cut off by the rest of the world. We'd be able to trade with each other, I would imagine, at that point. But if you don't, in this scenario, we haven't carried it right to the end. You would have so many farms infected, right, with this feed, and the fact that it's highly contagious, and people had not been alerted in advance, so there would have been lots of visitors. There would be, it would be a mushroom cloud of many, many farms infected. And the reality is you would probably have used the reserve bank that we have for vaccinations that is, again, an international, Canada, U.S., and Mexico. It's at Plum Island. It's the antigens. We pick the antigen that's closest to the disease, send it off for reconstitution, and you probably have to try and vaccinate to have a firewall around the outbreak. And at that point in time, it changes your status with respect to getting back into the world market for trade, because vaccination of animals can mask the presence of disease. So, but you just can't kill them fast enough. That would be the situation. That's the agreement that Canada and the U.S. both have, is that we wouldn't vaccinate unless we couldn't kill them quickly enough to prevent the disease from spreading. So once you've vaccinated the animals, you've got a little bit of a liability. The way that the OIE now sort of recommends, and these are just standards, and countries can take them or leave them, that a previously free country that stamps out, in other words, all the animals, the last infected animals gone, can enter the trade arena again after 3 months. However, if they use vaccination to try and control the outbreak, and then they manage to get it under control, they can enter the trade arena 6 months after if they use vaccination. So it makes a difference. So we would follow the international standards and open it up after 3 or 6 months, after you got it all under control.
We spoke earlier about, in a sense, not only the fact that the outbreak has been not only in Ohio, but it's gone interstate in the United States. The Canadian-American border is a little bit longer than this table. How do you go about, if you will, protecting the entire border, and do you then begin the process of simply not enabling beef from the United States to come into Canada at all? You just, I guess my question is, when do you leave the southern Ontario area and go either east or west?
It would be the entire border that we would try and prevent the movement of, and there's no question the U.S. would do the same, similar to what has happened in the past. And there's just no movement of animals or things that could carry the organism, the disease.
From a FEMA perspective, what does that all mean? It means, in terms of trying to integrate now, if you will, going beyond the immediate, but also looking internationally, cross-border, what's FEMA going to try to do with all this?
That'd be a very hard issue for FEMA to deal with for a lot of reasons. One of the things that FEMA would do at the very start would be to contact the composite agencies in these emergency support functions to find out quickly what their resource levels are so that they could be available to send. And the purpose for doing that would be to buy things. When you're into the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th day of an event, FEMA becomes a large purchasing agent for the states and the local governments under what is called mission assignments under the Stafford Act. Tammy's here, and she's very well versed in that. And that means that the states literally order what the cities and counties need. So one of the things that we do is to start getting a listing of things that you think the state is going to need, leading forward, talking to the state at the local county emergency management agency, seeing what could be there, working through the emergency operations center, which would be a key place for us to be, to find out inventories. Now, blending them with the Canadians would be difficult right now because I don't think that we have that treaty authority. Does that mean that Congress couldn't act immediately? They probably could and probably would, but for the scenario we'd have to say probably, because we're not certain that those things would be done. All we can say is that it's not a difficult thing for FEMA to task the composite agencies, agriculture, what have you got, what can you get, transportation, what have you got, what can you get, all across the board. So FEMA director would have pretty decent knowledge of the type of things that the states are asking for, the states are likely to ask for, based on what the locals. I mean, I was talking to Buck. He brought us some back there. Brought us some real good points. A lot of what the state asks for comes from the locals. In other words, the ground truth is generated on the ground. And it's a cliche in emergency management, but it's also one that we have to live by. They'll be bubbling up their needs to the state, and we'll be trying to look ahead to see what they're going to do. Some of the mistakes that were made in Katrina had to do with, I'm not talking out of shop, water, ice cubes, meals ready to eat. As far as logistics things, I don't know if they were mistakes or not. We could talk for hours and hours about why. But those are the kind of things here, seeing Katrina, seeing the issues, we try to make sure that we had listings of things available to give to you and then see what the higher powers decide. But we could find out what's available across the country. That's not a problem. Emergency management agencies have wonderful lists of everything. Trucks, people, contracts. They have set contracts that things go like that. And then we tap them, and then we pay for it through these mission assignments. So I guess that we'd be inventorying and we'd be getting ready to pay, because at that stage, the only response assets that FEMA really has physically would be those through the ESFs, those assets, the physical assets that the EPA would do, usually contractors going out for hazmat materials, burials. The Department of Transportation, they don't have federal truck drivers. They have federal contracts all over, and we blend those with the emergency management agency that also has contracts. Sometimes the contracts are very similar, so you want to make sure that you're not going to the same well 5 times. That's a tricky coordination element. The only things that we really own primarily are the emergency medical assistance teams, 106 or 7 at last batch. The veterinary teams would be important. We still haven't got a resolution. I noticed that the Canadian health minister said that it isn't a health issue now for people. So does that mean that means now the people issue isn't there, right? Or is it?
Could be.
Well, if it would be, then we would keep our 55 medical assistance teams on alert. We'd be sending them out to the state as the state needed. The state could either send them to hospitals to backfill, or the state could have us go to field hospitals. Sometimes that's a wise thing, a field hospital, because then you don't contaminate your hospital. But we'd be guided by what the State Emergency Management Agency wanted. They'd be guided by what the State Health Department wanted. So where we send our stuff would be on where they told us to. There's a difficulty. A good state can be very effective. If the state's not good at telling you where to go, you've got a problem. You've got all this engine in neutral, and you want to start, and legally you can't just start sending the stuff in, and common sense wise too.
Ms. Minter, you want to jump in?
Yes, I wanted to clarify a point on movement of or shutting down trade. Remember that the idea is to prevent the spread of foot and mouth in Canada, so it's a disease. It doesn't mean that we're going to shut down, let's say, chicken importation if FMD does not affect chicken or eggs. Also, Canada, as they say, is from sea to sea to sea. This disease has been found in Ohio. You can have trade going on in Vancouver and BC and, California. So it all depends. You have to put it in perspective. We are not going to shut trade down from the end of this table to this table. You have to remember it's to prevent the spread of this disease. And with that, we can maneuver. There's room to maneuver, but we have to put it in the right perspective, the trade issue.
Dr.
I think initially, Gloria's quite right. Initially, we would shut the border. That's something that every country does with a disease like this, because you don't know.
It does initially shut?
We shut the entire border because no one knows how widely dispersed it is. But certainly one of the biggest moves afoot around the world now is to try and reconcile the reality. Borders have been used irrationally in the past, and so now we're trying to be a little bit more targeted and scientific. So there's a big move afoot to talk about zones. So countries are sovereign countries, and the borders we can stop the movement in, but we'd probably zone the states very quickly. We're good neighbors that way, and we know that your veterinary infrastructure is strong. And as soon as you had a handle on what the extent of this outbreak was, we would resume trade.
What does that mean practically? That you, at the beginning, would go end to end and then start narrowing it?
That's right. And the case would be put forward by the USDA and by the, primarily by the USDA, but certainly aided by the industry, that the movements of animals in normal marketing streams is only this far. After the incubation period of the disease, after the last outbreak, we'd be able to see that it hadn't really spread beyond what the normal marketing movements are, and there would be a case made with enough surveillance. We'd be looking for a whole lot of surveillance evidence that around the area that you have a good handle on how far it's spread, and then we'd open from parts of the country that are free. We do that regularly. We did it, Newcastle, we first shut you down when you had Newcastle, and then we...
Do you want to educate the public what Newcastle?
Oh, Newcastle disease is a disease of poultry, and it was a real nightmare for the USDA in California and in the Southwest, when it was in backyard and fighting birds and so on. So it was a lot of little flocks, and then moved into the commercial flocks. And it was a very difficult disease to control. And I think that probably it's the most recent outbreak situation between the two countries that we've had to deal with. It wasn't very long before just the affected states were the ones that were prohibited to ship product and live birds into Canada. So we accepted the evidence that they had it under control.
So in essence, what you're saying, there's a balance here. On the one hand, you want to protect Canadians in Southern Ontario. On the other hand, you don't want to curtail or harm American and Canadian trade interests.
Of course. And if it doesn't serve any purpose,
yeah,
there's no reason why it should be done.
But the question is, going back to Mr. Waski, he's trying to find the bad guys.
Yes.
And what then will be the level of cooperation between Mr. Waski and your Canadian counterparts?
Phenomenal. It's one of the closest relationships I know the FBI has with the RCMP, the Ontario Provincial Police, the local police departments. They have officers full-time in our headquarters on a full-time basis. And as I said, we are working many investigations jointly right now, as well as these type of crisis situations. And
so that means, in essence, through this cooperative effort, and after Mr. Yarish has told you where Mrs. Yarish is, you're going to, because he wants her to stay there.
Right. And we can help him out if he helps us out. We can make our
Theme number 1 from today, it's all about mutual interests. You're then going to work with your RCMP counterparts?
We have a legal attaché stationed in our American Embassy in Ottawa who will make the initial contact with the Canadian government, and we would immediately join forces if necessary, if the investigation led that there was an investigative interest. Right now we have an agricultural interest.
But go back to that message you received an hour and a half ago from, however you received your information from your intel, that this is evidently a terrorist attack. So that then moves you into the investigatory move.
Right. Right. We do the same thing we'd be doing with Mr. Yaris of the farm up there. What common people have visited both farms? What is there a family member that might be part of a group of some intelligence information? I mean, we'd be looking at anything that might lead us to it. And, this isn't just a Middle Eastern group. It might be an animal rights issue. It might be a
group of law students.
It could be anybody, of any information. So we don't want to limit ourselves of stereotype what a terrorist attack could be. You have environmental groups that are committing these type of offenses. You have animal rights issues. You have we can't just focus on international terrorists. It could be domestically as well.
Ms. Minter, you'd want to jump in.
In this instance, I know that we have the Mutual Legal Assistance Program, Assistance Treaty between the U.S. and Canada that can certainly be invoked to assist in the investigation. I don't know the details of the procedures under the treaty, but it's certainly an instrument that is there that can be invoked when it comes to this investigation.
From your perspective, Dr. Inch, what you're hearing here is going to be satisfactory from a veterinary perspective, in terms of the cooperation and the closing of these zones, and if you will, to curtail or limit the spread of the disease?
Yes. If we're lucky, we won't be infected, and if we were not lucky, and in fact the disease had infected the initial farm, the index farm, and we're spreading in southern Ontario, we would probably declare a control area. It's been mentioned before that the Minister of Agriculture, similar to what I think happens here with the governor of the state declaring an emergency, we would declare a control area under the Health of Animals Act. Gloria can talk to you about what we'd do.
First, when we declare an infected place, it's on the basis of suspicion, or it can be on the basis of suspicion. Once the disease is confirmed and we know that it exists, it's possible that the zone is going to get much wider by way of the control area. And this is a power that only the Minister of Agriculture can invoke. It cannot be delegated. But it can be a whole province, it can be 2 provinces, it can be as wide as, it takes to control the disease. Obviously, that is going to have an impact on how much of the border is going to be shut down and what is going in and what is coming out, because it all has ramifications. But immediately it's confirmed, and we find that because we can't keep going, one farm here, infected place, 5 kilometers around it, one farm here, 5 kilometers around it, one farm here, 5 kilometers around it. So at that point, we do the declaration of control area, and it's a much, much wider area. And it has restrictions, what moves in, what moves out, what moves within the control area. So it will definitely have impact on the the trade issue as well.
Dr. Inch, you want to add something?
Well, just the control area declaration, of course, is the point in time that you call upon all of your partners, because in effect, nothing is allowed to leave that area into the rest of Canada either.
When you say partners, partners being the American partners?
Well, no, partners, the law enforcement agencies and all of the others that would allow us to actually stop traffic if they were containing livestock, and to go into markets and stop commerce. And there's a series of, would be looking at all of our public, the radio systems and everything else to alert producers that if they have a truck is on the road to a slaughterhouse, if it's got more than 1 farm worth of animals in it, they would have to stop and wait till the abattoir cleared animals out of there and then proceed. There's a whole regime that occurs. It's a stop movement declaration, in effect, this control area. Very powerful, and we would certainly not do it lightly, not until we had an outbreak. But I'm sure it's similar to what happens here in the state.
Is that something that FEMA would impose the other way? That is to say that if foot-and-mouth disease had come from Canada here, these kinds of control areas, zone areas, curtailing of trade, is that something that you could foresee us doing?
It'd be a tough issue because it'd be above FEMA and it'd be below FEMA.
It'd be a Homeland Security issue, border and customs issue. The customs at the border, and they would be the ones enforcing the actual embargo or movement.
Above us here and then beneath us for the states clarifying what was done at Homeland. That would be the coordinating group for those type of things.
Unlike in the Canadian perspective, where it's not the provinces, but it's the federal government. And here it would be the states, if I understand you correctly. No, go ahead. Right. As is their border. But once it crosses the border, it's a state issue in the United States, correct? In terms of once it's in a particular state. Tammy, is that correct? Help me out here.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture can and the Center of Disease Control can issue edicts to all the states to follow. But it would be those, and it would filter down to the state and local health departments or veterinarian type of groups and the agricultural departments of the various states.
Yeah, there's because of the terrorist aspect and because of the quick movement, there are some pieces of the law being restructured right now. The Stafford Act, and also the newer pieces, regulations are being drafted, I guess as we speak. I saw some drafts about a month ago regarding emergency public health declarations. Those aren't, I don't think they're quite finished, so we couldn't be invoking them. They're decisions being made right now on which types of events could be paid for, would be paid for, who's going to direct, can CDC come in and stop things or move things, can AG do that? These are issues that are being dealt with as a second wave. In other words, first wave was the National Incident Management System and the National Response Plan, which have come out in the last 7 or 8 months, updating the Federal Response Plan and Incident Command. Now we're at the stage where I think everything is going to be probably looked at again with Katrina. So we'll have two, unless you guys have a different cut, there'll be There'll be the changes that are based on Katrina. There'll be the changes that I don't think we're finished regarding the emergency public health declarations, both of those which I think would be relevant for what we're dealing with here. So if we had a disaster right now, we'd have some serious issues. But I think they would probably come to the fore because these kind of things can be decided quickly. I mean, I don't say they're rocket science, they're common sense. The hard part is the organizational politics, I think, not the common sense science of them. I think that's the easiest part. The other part is harder, I think.
Dr. Inge?
I agree that there would probably be lots still to work out, but there has been such tremendous progress in the last few years since 9/11. It's amazing that such a non-agricultural event has led to changes such as we've seen. But in Canada, we've adopted the incident command system, for example, which allows us all to respond in a way that's using common terminology. And we're training people to respond in a way that's not traditional for them. We had an agricultural response that was quite unique to our organization, and so. But that's in part because we're, for example, right now in Fort Collins, we're sharing training methods to first responders, veterinary responders, with it's the Quadrilateral Group, the Canada, U.S., Australia, New Zealand, has brought together their trainers from all over to share how they prepare for a foreign animal disease outbreak and incident command training. So all of this is fairly recent. I've been doing this business for a little while now, and I haven't seen such a level of cooperation in emergency response as we've seen in the last few years.
Ted, you wanted to add something? So here's what I'm taking from this, that if, like Mr. Yarsh, his wife comes into Southern Ontario, and as soon as you find out where she is, you're going to make every possible effort to limit the restriction placed, be it on Americans or on livestock from America into Canada. Is that a correct assessment? Did I understand you correctly? I mean, the idea is going to be to limit the restriction, to curtail the restriction.
Well, we would have to balance, I think, the risk. It's very much, this scenario's got a wild card in that we've got somebody coming into Canada, but the reality is, the minute we heard that there was foot and mouth disease in the United States, we shut the border to animal traffic and to product traffic across the country until we had a handle on the extent to which it was in the U.S., especially considering the proximity, actually.
Right.
So that would be the first step.
And also, it's not just to U.S. products. Once we put the controls in, it affects Canadian products as well. Because within the zone, let's say if it's a control area, you can't have things moving in and out without a permit.
Right.
So it's not just you. It's to stop the disease, and if it means Canadian products being moved under restrictions, sure we will. Or the power is there at least, let's put it that way, to invoke, those movement restrictions.
And again, you've got the idea that we would do, both sides of the border would do what they could that would least impact trade and but control the disease. And so there would be a temporal, as you knew more, you would change the restrictions, yeah.
And what Dr. Inchier has said is important in terms of understanding the scenario that we put together, because if you go back to the first slides of what Dr. Gorman was talking about a few hours ago, Ohio is such an agricultural dependent state that a restriction of livestock from Ohio into Canada would have such an impact on the economy of the state. And that's important. That's a point that needs to be remembered and to be emphasized, because going back to how we started the morning and why we went with this scenario, because, as I say, Ohio is so dependent on agriculture. All right, with that, I turn it over to the distinguished audience for questions for Mr. Waski, Mr. Andropoloni, and our two friends from Canada who have flown all the way to answer your questions. Mr. Archer, you're wondering where your wife is. I know, right? No. Wait, hang on, you need a mic. Wait. Holmes.
Using my volume, I don't need one. On behalf of my wife, she's not here to defend herself. And as of 11th of next month, we'll be together 42 years. So I'll tell you something. what I wanted to ask is, didn't you guys, or didn't the two countries just go through a similar thing with mad cow disease when they closed the borders for shipment of beef? Yeah. Is that, have they opened the borders yet or not, or where are we at with that?
We've got it open for animals that are less than 30 months of age. That's the existing status. So there's a lot of movement, because that's the primary movement of animals to be fed and slaughtered down here, and vice versa.
I don't think we are quite out of the woods yet. Yet it's been opened, but we have our cows, seeking injunction and whatnot. So it's moving now, but, it could be shut again anytime. We don't know.
But I'm saying, in other words,
we've done
not
it before.
The hoof and mouth end of it, but it's still, you've had a similar scare that would prepare us for what's coming down the road.
Yeah, we know how, we do know how we'd operate in each other's, what regulations have to be put in place to have the border change status.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it cuts both ways, the shutting down of the trade. It cuts both ways. It's not only Canada that imposes. When we had a BSE, U.S. shut us down. So it's all to protect, trade interest and whatnot on each side.
Dr. Amos, you didn't mention at all whether Canada has any measures in place as far as compensating farmers when their animals are destroyed, like we heard the agriculture people say are in place here in the U.S. Is there any such measures in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is, and it's in the Health of Animals Act. So, Gloria, can you address that?
Yeah. You will get, or you may get compensation. A farmer may get compensation only if their animals are ordered destroyed under the Act. So if the farmer is proactive, sees the disease coming down the road and kills the animals by himself, he's shut himself out of the compensation scheme. Unfortunately, that's how it works. Also, the amount given is fair market value up to a maximum prescribed by regulations, and we do have regulations. If the animal is not listed, fortunately, cows are listed, and I think the maximum is $2,500. If the animal is not listed, there is a default amount of $30. So that is the compensation regime. You can also, the farmer can also be compensated for disposal costs, and also if things are ordered destroyed again by the CFIA. So, things like the feed, if it's ordered destroyed, will be compensated for. If the farmer is not satisfied with the amount of compensation, or if they decide that the refusal to compensate is not unreasonable, there is an appeal mechanism in place. But at the end of the day, the person who is hearing the appeal cannot go over the maximums that are established by the regulations. So that's the legal aspect of it. But I know that there are some other policies that they can pull money out of.
There's an interesting dilemma with compensation. I'm sure that the policymakers here have thought of this. The fact is, when you've got an outbreak and a depressed market because you're shipping overseas, suddenly the value of the animal, the infected animal, is more than the non-infected animal. So you've got that difficulty of a trade-off and trying to ensure that compensation doesn't become a goal. The first producer that's infected may be the luckiest, because after that, there's people who are feeding animals whose value is much lower, and they can't sell them. They can't, and so there's compensation is an issue that takes a lot of work, and we're constantly struggling in Canada with how you determine market value. Is it pre-outbreak market value you compensate for, or is it at the time of the outbreak, where the animals are virtually a negative asset because you've got to feed them. So it's just that's just an interesting dilemma that we find ourselves in in an outbreak.
Also, sometimes you have, special breeds, thoroughbreds, purebreds, or whatever the terms are. They might have cost the farmer, $4,000, $5,000 on this one animal, and all they get at the maximum is $2,500. So, we have a lot of issues around compensation. People are very, very unhappy. We have letters flying up and down, in the minister's office. And don't we have some policies where they may be able to pull some money from somewhere? But as far as the law is concerned, we are bound by these maximum amounts. You do have some programs.
There are programs that stabilize incomes, as you have here in the States, when a producer can prove a loss over the previous year and so on and so forth. You have market income stabilization programs. What we suggest that producers for valuable animals have private insurance. So if you've got a stud bull that's worth $100,000, you should have them insured, and I think that's probably makes common sense, business sense everywhere.
About the fair market value, is that based on commodity beef prices, or like for dairy cattle, they're going to be different value than
It's a very nebulous concept. Yeah. I mean, the case law is that fair market value is what a willing buyer and a willing seller are prepared, is prepared to pay for your animal. So like Caroline said, it gets to a point where the value is going down. But I think in the long run, they try to be, fair, that if your animal was killed first, you would not get more than somebody whose animal was killed last, because by that time, the values are depressed. But they try to be fair, and I'm not too sure what goes, beyond what if, a willing buyer is prepared to pay. It really is very, very hard.
The complications. Sorry, go ahead. No. Yeah, there's a complication, for example, in the production cycles of poultry, for example, where you've got animals that you don't normally buy or sell because they're between production stages. They're just coming on them into laying eggs. So there's a future gain, but we don't pay for future gains. We pay for that value. So it's complicated. Are you the one that raised earlier the insider trading issue? Yes. I know that everybody laughed, but suddenly a light bulb went on, for me at least. The reality is that we have a lot of huge vertically integrated businesses, more and more in Canada, I'm sure you do too. And so a lot of producers are actually just working for, say, a big group like Maple Leaf Incorporated. And so if they were the first farm and the vet's sitting there, they could easily phone their Maple Leaf and say, we think that we've got foot and mouth disease here, and it wouldn't take an executive long to realize they'd better dump anything to do with animal products. And so that's something that hadn't occurred to me before you raised it. With the way that agriculture goes these days, it could be a very
I thought WAR's set up with the NASDAQ and the stock thing was all part of waiting to see the stock market drop like a rock when that thing came out. I mean, it is one of those things that in today's day and age is a very real possibility.
We have people trying to claim for, labor. We've killed the animals, they can't stock yet, they cannot fire their workers, they're still paying them. We have, them coming to us, what do? We have to keep the barns, going. We cannot compensate for any of those costs.
There was a question over there, right? You had your hand up?
I did have a question for the criminal investigation side. Would it make a difference if it was a state-sponsored terrorist act versus some fringe group that has an interest in what's going on in Iraq, as far as what you would do in your investigation?
Of course, the scope of the investigation would be very different. I mean, what's going on in Iraq, it does lend itself to an international group of how we prioritize and implement a plan, investigate a plan, and But it would not be exclusive. It would be very much of what went on in that farm. You know, the access. Did it happen with the feed? Did it happen with, did he just get a new load of cattle in? Where'd it come from? What's going on? What the intelligence is telling us of within the intelligence community of was there reports of intrusions? Is there mink farms in the area? Is there, you know, all the different things that we would ask, but these demands, when we got this letter, I mean, yes, we would be querying people. We know that Al-Qaeda is looking at biological, chemical, and nuclear capabilities. We are looking at what is, you know, is there, who has come there, but by no means would it limit ourselves to, we have to keep our minds open, because once we focus in an area, that's when, you know, you get into this profiling and those issues of assuming something, and that's the most dangerous word in law enforcement, is assume, and break it down, and you don't want to make out of you and me, but it's very, very important that we don't limit our investigative direction until the evidence tells us where it is.
Wait, you have a question? No.
How long would it be before farms are allowed to restock in Canada? Is there a restriction?
Yes, that again is set in standards, and generally speaking, 21 days after the farm has been C&D'd, as we say, cleaned and disinfected, we could consider restocking. We might decide to put sentinel animals on there first, and that would be part of the ensuring that we had adequately cleaned and disinfected. I think in the case of foot and mouth disease we might, because it can be harbored for a long time and it's hard to get rid of every speck of mud. So our policy would incorporate that, would put animals on, and we'd pay for that. That would be part of it.
We did that for avian influenza. After all the places have been cleaned and disinfected, we waited 21 days. We put in sentinel birds, and if they survived, then the farmer was allowed to restock fully. So we do that.
Is that Mike?
How long can the virus remain viable when it's not in the host, when it's in the ground, or the buried animals? How long does the virus remain viable?
Depending on the situation, as we heard earlier, that it's fairly sensitive to both acid and base conditions, but if you've got the right situation, it can be in mud for up to a year. So the big thing about cleaning is you really do have to clean the organic matter and then disinfect. It's a sensitive virus to disinfection. So if you get rid of the organic matter, you can actually clean things very easily, but it can last a long time. I've got a chart in the strategy here, and it's very variable, but I was really surprised as I was reading through again that a year in mud, 360 or 80 days or something. So.
Even in frozen ground, or?
Freezing is the best way to keep that virus. Yeah.
Sunlight would kill it, right?
Pardon?
Sunlight would kill it?
It's, it's susceptible to sunlight, but freezing is bad. Yeah.
It's not good for Canada then.
No, that's right. Well, they're in the same boat here.
Practically speaking, what are proactive steps that the U.S. and, well, anybody should be taking to prevent these bioterrorism? I mean, we've been talking about this topic and the specific foot and mouth, but we haven't really said a lot about, the keynote speaker had said we're not being proactive enough. What do you believe that we should be doing as a country to be more proactive?
It's a great question. You know, it really is the essence of September 11th. of what we need to do, and collaboration is probably the most important one. Integration between the agencies, between countries, of information and knowledge. You know, it's an old cliche, knowledge is based on perception, and perception is based on knowledge. Of understanding the medical community along with the research community and the pharmaceutical community, and how that integrates into response. Biological issues are the most difficult because of the significant incubation periods, and basically they commit a crime and they got 2 weeks, 3 days, a month to get away and to hide what they've done, and you know, it's a lot different than a chemical or a radiological, and somewhat a lot quicker. So these are the most difficult, and a lot of this stuff exists normally, you know, and the ability to manufacture some of these things is you can't stop it all, but you know, risk management is also very important. I think what Professor Gostin is saying, you know, of how do you convince a pharmaceutical company to make millions of doses of vaccine that sits in a storage warehouse? Who's going to pay for it? And that's really what it comes down to, what the balance of, do you want to have a tax rate at 40% in order to have all the answers? Or do you want to, it's that political balance that we are constantly in. We will never, ever have all the answers. But what we need to do is be in a position to get the answers and be proactive in managing the risk of where things might happen, and knowing about it. I know the FBI's role along through our Joint Terrorism Task Forces is not, I mean, right now my office is practicing a terrorist attack, a tabletop in my office with our thing in Washington, is ask yourself the what ifs and practice plan, you know, what do I do when this happens? And I think someone else mentioned of, you know, it's not the time to meet somebody in a crisis. And it's not the time to think of what you would do in a crisis. Training and awareness. You know, the most powerful prevention method is these people in the room, away from this table, is you. Of you taking the time to come and understand this. So when a stranger comes on your property and you have it, you know, hey, you remember that and you report it. We'll run it down for you, and to make sure that's the, you know, the change from September 11th. And you know, conversely, what is prevention? Understanding what, you know, is his government doing the right things to make sure nothing happens? How do you prove a negative? Is a very difficult question to answer. How do I know what I did today prevented something from happening? You know, the only thing I know is hopefully when I go to bed tonight, nothing happened. And it's a new paradigm that the American public, law enforcement, the medical community, of you know, what vaccines, what should we have on standby, because we don't have the resources to answer every question. It's just high risk, low frequency, medium frequency, you know, it's those risk management paradigms that we have to explore and be prepared to address. And it's all geared also on intelligence, the partners with foreign governments of anticipating. You know, what is Al-Qaeda doing in Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq? What are they looking to do? And it's not that what we think they might be doing, what are the Pakistani government finding out about what their people are doing, so we can be prepared to address those issues. And if they're not doing it, that might be placed down on the, in that political wing. It becomes a very complicated issue, and it's probably the best question that I've heard of what can you do ahead of time. We need to do anything and everything within our resources. And the best resources is collaboration, that synergistic effect of putting teams together, of the medical, you know, of the expertise. And when I first got here, that Joint Operations Center, and why it is difficult to say who's in charge, because at any particular moment, the medical people need to be in charge. The law enforcement people need to be in charge. The state and local people need to be in charge. at the scene of incident command, because they're the ones who bring in the horses. And that's it's something, yes, we all are accountable. And ultimately, the FBI will be accountable, but which is okay. Because the most important thing is does the FBI put the right person in charge to get the right answer, in the best interest. So it's a long-winded, complicated answer, and I hope I didn't feel like I danced it around for it. So.
Mr. Yarsh, you have the last question of the day because you were the star.
No, I know we went through all this today, and I've learned a lot here today. But in my 65 years, I've seen a lot of ups and downs and crises, and we always seem to rally around and come ahead. So when I go to bed at night, I got a lot of confidence in you.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
And
Thank you. On that note, we thank all of you, truly. We're going to take a 2-second break. Professor Scharf, Professor Hoffman, Professor Hill, myself.
Thank you.
No? No.
Hey. You want to take a farewell?
Oh.
That's fine.
Whatever you want. You want to start? Start. Second, Jessie? Girl, boy, boy. Huh? Absolutely. We'll be in and out. We're quick.
Yeah, this is going to be quick. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Sharona? Ladies and gentlemen, Mel.
Good afternoon. Thanks to everybody for staying, and I just want to compliment Professor Guiora and Aaron Page. I have learned so much from today. This really has been a very innovative and educational experience, I think, for everyone. And Mr. Yarsh, we couldn't have found a better farmer to play your role, so thanks so much for your participation. I am just going to make a few observations about what I think the issues that have raised, what issues have been raised, and what questions remain. I think a lot of this was designed for us to explore how prepared we are, what works in terms of our preparedness, what doesn't work, and what we should know and try to improve upon before we face this kind of scenario or another bioterrorism attack in reality. And I don't have answers as to what works and what doesn't work, but I think that's the crux of the question. I think we learned the importance of collaboration, the importance of different agencies working together and knowing who exactly should tackle each aspect of the crisis. I think the importance of the media was emphasized and re-emphasized. What do you communicate to the public? What do you communicate internationally to our allies? And what do you communicate to other agencies? So I was very much impressed with the importance of the media. The potential conflict between private and public interests. How do you incentivize corporations and other private parties to do the right thing, to cooperate, unless you impose sanctions? And what importance should private interests have versus common good, versus public interests? When do you underreact and when do you overreact? When are there problems in terms of the reaction? Do you jump and inform Homeland Security as soon as you have the suspicion of one cow getting sick? And yet you don't want to delay, and it's very difficult to tell when each step should be taken and when you might be overreacting or not reacting quickly enough. State versus federal powers. We certainly saw that with Katrina. Who should take charge? Who knows that they should take charge? There are advantages to acting on a more local level. You have more efficiency. You have more knowledge of the local circumstances and local resources. And yet sometimes the federal government can be more effective. It can create consistency among the different states and different locations. It might have more resources and more expertise. You certainly don't want a conflict between the state and federal governments. Does the law provide sufficient guidelines as to what measures can and cannot be taken in particular circumstances? Do we know when we can declare a state of emergency? Do we know when we can start limiting civil rights and individual rights? And are there dangers to limiting civil rights and individual rights? You might have to do that. You might have to quarantine. You might have to force people to accept vaccinations or to give their cattle vaccinations. But there are also dangers, as we know, with vaccinations. There is a certain rate of death or very serious complications. Should we require mandatory testing? Should we require destruction of property? However, the danger is that people will simply avoid reporting that they have observed some illness in their cattle, or they will avoid seeking medical care if we're talking about a bioterrorism attack such as smallpox or some illness that affects human beings. So where do you draw the line in terms of limiting individual rights? And economic freedom, of course, is important. In any such situation, you might have to destroy cattle. You might have to force businesses to share data that they don't want to share. You might have to force them to produce vaccines that they don't want to produce. What are the implications of that? And again, when are you limiting or affecting economic freedom adversely to an extent that is too great? And I think an issue we didn't talk a lot about is at least under some of the state statutes and the Model Act that Dr. Gostin authored, there is an issue of immunity where actors in these kinds of state emergencies are given immunity because otherwise no one is going to jump in and provide health care or provide very quick reaction in an emergency. So in order to incentivize people to come forward and be willing to provide care and be willing to participate in the reaction, we often provide immunity, except for gross negligence. Well, that's also problematic because people who are hurt unjustifiably do not receive compensation. People might not act as carefully as they should in carrying out the response. So what are the liability and immunity issues that are implicated in this kind of emergency? So these are just some of the issues that I have thought about and that I think this activity raised for us.
I just want to add a few comments to that about what I think I took away from today's exercise. I, first of all, found it extraordinarily informative. There was so much information conveyed today. I think that there's some things that are certainly still troubling in terms of in light of the sort of increasingly frightening scenario that unfurled before us today, and the fact that, as we've all been discussing, we really don't have a good answer to how to look forward still. But I do think there's reason to be optimistic about that. Both, because one thing that was apparent from today's exercise is that we have a lot of very high-quality people at every level involved in these sets of issues, and very serious, thoughtful people who are seriously planning for various contingencies. But also, I think what this simulation was most aimed at demonstrating, and what it did demonstrate, is the incredible power of having sort of everyone in one room. Folks across agencies, professions, geographic localities, and not just the importance of this, but not just the power of this, but the importance of this. That, as we've discussed, we can hopefully avoid mishaps in the future, and could have avoided some in the past had there been more of this type of collaboration. As Ms. Wilt said at one point, it's important to build relationships so that the first time you meet someone isn't in the context of a crisis. I think that it's important not just for sort of coordination and preparedness, but for building trust and trusting relationships that might help smooth some of the problems that Professor Hoffman just mentioned, not only across agencies, but in terms of agency press relationships or government press relationships, and relationships between governments and the affected individuals, and the willingness of individuals to work with government agencies. At the same time, as I think Mr. Meyer had pointed out, there's still much left to be done on this front in terms of getting everyone together in one room. So if we and hopefully other academic institutions can play any role, it might be, and if there's one thing we kind of, for our part, can do affirmatively going forward, I think it's a great thing to facilitate this, getting folks together in one room to work out problems, and if nothing else, to build those sorts of relationships going forward.
Okay, my closing thoughts. Well, first of all, let me thank the panelists again. It was so good of you to take time off of your very important jobs and your very busy jobs, and for you to come from your farm to give us this very realistic and exciting simulation. Also, I want to thank the organizers, especially Amos and Aaron, who we couldn't have done this without. Also, the TV station that donated their production crew for those very realistic simulations. And people that you don't see, especially Nancy Pratt, who is really the conference organizer for all the conferences we have. And thank you also the AV crew, who helps us produce this and make this webcast. I want to echo a couple of the thoughts of Sharona and Jessie. First, the lesson of Katrina seems to have taken well, and it's sad that it took a natural disaster, but it's great that we've learned from it. In my area, where we talk about war crimes, we often say that human rights law began only because of Adolf Hitler, and maybe the same kind of thing can be said about national preparedness and disasters, that it took Katrina to really push us along the right path. Well, the lesson seems to be you have to have a plan in advance, you have to practice it, and you have to perfect it. And I have to say I feel much more confidence, having heard from all of you today, that you've gone through those steps, that the next time there is a national disaster, I believe things will go much more smoothly. We also have heard that coordination is critical, and I want to echo what Jessie said, that some of the players we heard have met each other for the first time through this conference. And one of our goals in having this conference was to facilitate the familiarity and trust among the players and the press as well. And we hope that you will continue to build on that. In terms of the information release, which I found to be one of the more interesting of the issues that were explored here, at first I thought, well, gee, you're damned if you do release, because it'll cause hysteria, and the people might act incorrectly, and you may not have enough information, but you're damned if you don't. And I was really interested to hear the panelists say that they would err on the side of releasing, while being careful not to push the public from helpful fear to unhelpful terror or hysteria. My provocative question that I asked about, what does an official do if if he or she is ordered not to release information or to release misinformation, I understand caused a lot of discussions in the hallways. And some of the officials came up to me and said, well, we understand you're just playing devil's advocate because, of course, no one in our agency would ever do that. I have to tell you that wasn't just a hypothetical. I worked for 5 years in the U.S. Department of State as Attorney Advisor for UN Affairs during the Bosnia crisis. And we got information from the CIA, this is all now public, but at the time it was classified, indicating that genocide was occurring in Bosnia and that it really was very one-sided. And the government high-up officials did not want to intervene at that point. And in order to avoid being pushed into intervening, they concocted the story that it was a balanced civil war with all sides equally responsible. And the lower-level people said that's not what the intelligence indicates, and we were ordered to tell that story in Q&A with the press and in testimony with the Hill. And 9 of my colleagues resigned over that. I couldn't because as a lawyer it wouldn't have done me any good to resign. I couldn't go to the press. I had an attorney-client relationship, and the information would have had to be kept secret. But I worked on the inside for 2 more years until they finally ended up calling it genocide. And I think there is a parallel. I mean, if people will suppress information about genocide for business or others, who knows what might happen at the national or state or local level. And I was so glad to hear that the people here have thought about that. And I think every government official has a duty to think about that in advance, and that you would confront your superiors and you would push them as hard as possible, and ultimately you would be ready to resign if you had to. And I think that hopefully you'll never have that situation, but when your superiors know that subordinates have thought that through, it's much more likely that that won't occur. And I found that a very interesting discussion. My final point is, like the famous simulation Dark Winter, this simulation, the fifth plague, and by the way, did we ever tell everybody what fifth plague stands for? I'm not sure. The plain dealer asked me as they were leaving. Does anybody know what the fifth plague stands for? Raise your hand. Yeah?
It's the fifth plague that God brought on Egypt
Right.
as a result of the children.
Right. The next time you watch Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments, focus on the plagues he brought on. Who played the Pharaoh in that? Yeah, Yul Brynner. Yeah, focus on that. The fifth one was he made all the animals get ill, the cows especially. And so the fifth plague here was hoof and mouth disease. But anyway, so cattle disease, right? So we hope that the fifth plague will have continuing use and relevance. And the webcast, which probably 500 or 600 people have watched today live, will also be archived and available. You can watch it at any time. And you can fast forward, you can rewind to your favorite times and moments, like Wharf Blitzer. Also, we're going to be producing about 100 CD-ROMs. And we're not going to give them to everybody because it's cost prohibitive, but anybody who requests them, we'll send them to. And hopefully, especially you in the agencies, will want to use the CD-ROMs and send them around. So if you send an email to either Amos or myself, we'll get those right out to you. So anyway, and finally, for all of you that keep coming to our events, we've had a really exciting year. The year's not quite over. Next Friday, the Canada-U.S. Law Institute has its big conference on innovations. Since there was a Canadian angle here, we hope some of you will come back for that. And again, it's just been great to meet you all. And let me turn it over to Amos for the final word.
Short. A couple. If anybody, before I make the final word, say the final word, if there are any questions from the audience.
It's just like the law
Yes, sir.
students. They don't.
I have just one problem, Professor Scharf, with what you said. You said that you were encouraged by the fact that these people would resign their positions, and you said how happy you were that those 9 people quit. However, wouldn't it have been better if they absolutely, defied and were fired rather than quitting? Because by quitting, that means those 9 positions are going to be filled by lackeys who don't really care. It's the dumbing down of America. And that's my devil's advocate question.
I mean, there's a whole book by Derek Bach about, when do you have to resign when you're working in the government. I hope anybody in government has had a chance to study that. And that's always a tough decision, in any area. Ultimately, the resignations of my colleagues that were published in the front page of the New York Times and so forth had a big impact in changing foreign policy, more, I think, than they would have if they just fought on the inside, while I stayed and continued to fight. It's always a hard call, but what they said was that first they would go and confront their supervisors. And they would also indicate that if push came to shove, they might have to resign. And that in itself, I hope, is enough to get a higher level person to think twice about asking subordinates to not disclose important information or to give misinformation for other interests than the public health and safety.
Are there other questions? Final words. When we started working on this over a year ago, we asked ourselves how to put together a number of panels. Who do you bring in and how do you build the whole process? And this is the place to turn to our friends, our new friends from the Department of Agriculture in the state of Ohio. I begin with Leah Dorman. There's no way that I can thank you enough. Leah and I have spent tens, if not hundreds of hours talking about this stuff. We've been to Columbus. They've come up here. This really became a collaborative effort between Case Law School and the Department of Agriculture of the state of Ohio. I turn to all of you, our new friends, and say, your contribution is more than overwhelming. On behalf of all of us, I truly thank you. With that, I begin. I next turn to Mr. Yarish. When I called Mr. Yarish a year ago, as I said earlier, I'm not quite sure you understood what I was getting you into, right? There's not a person who didn't come up to me during the course of the day and the breaks and said that the best thing we did today was bringing you. And I'll tell you exactly why, sir. You are salt of the earth. You are realism quantified, and it could not have been the success it was without you. And you were, sir, you were a true credit, and we are greatly grateful to you for having participated and having been who you were. That was an enormous contribution you made for all of us, and for that, sir, I thank you. For the rest of the panelists, including those who came from Canada, I appreciate, as Professor Scharf said, taking time out of your very busy day to come and to answer the questions and to play along with the simulation. It's a different kind of experience. I told you in the morning this is going to require stepping outside of the box, having to flow with us. The TV clips, my new friend Wharf Blitzer here. It really is all about innovation, because I think to best understand these issues, you must really appreciate the need to study it in an innovative fashion. If you're unwilling to view it in an innovative fashion, we're going to be stuck. And if you're willing to be innovative, there really is an extraordinary opportunity to learn and to take it further. I'm not going to repeat the points that my colleagues have made, because I agree with most of what they've said, if not everything they've said. But the final thought. From our perspective here at the law school, and I can speak about the institute that I direct, and I'm sure that my colleagues will agree, the innovative approach to addressing the critical issues of the day, and that's what today is. It is a hot-button issue that people are hesitant to talk about. That's the reality. But if you're willing to engage people in dialogue, if you're willing to bring in different people who are going to be open about addressing the issues, things they know, things they don't know, there really is no limit to how much we can help. And we really do see ourselves as facilitators. And I think that would be the most important word from my perspective. We really do believe we can be facilitators as an educational institution. If we do our job well today, it really is nothing but step one. There needs to be step two and step three. There's no reason in the world why we can't repeat today on different issues. And the same issue I told Professor Hoffman earlier, there are endless spin-offs that can come out of today. I mean, there's so much information that's come out of today. I personally, from my perspective, view this as step one. I very much look forward to step two and step three. And I very much look forward to working with all of you on that. Thank you very much.
Before you leave, and before everybody leaves, just to let them know, there is a reception with food and drinks down on this floor, right around on the other side of this wall. So we'll continue our discussions with you then.
Thank you. Good job, Amos.
Oh, thank you very much.